We are in a series of studies where my goal is to help us to understand the big picture so that we can understand how the little pieces fit together. You know, if you're going to study a car, you first of all look at the whole car and you say, okay, here's what a car does. Then you start studying the carburetor and the individual pieces. Well, that's the way, too long in Bible study, what we've done is study individual chapters or books or passages, and we don't always understand how that fits, and you don't always know where to put that. I taught this material for many years at Oklahoma Christian University to the college kids, and the comment I got the most from the kids was, wow, for the first time I understand how that fits into the story. So that's my goal. I know this helped me more than anything else in my Bible study is to learn this material. So what we're doing first, I'm doing this a little backwards. We're starting with the New Testament, then we're going to go back and look at the Old. I have some notes that I handed out last week. If you didn't get a copy, I've got a few left. If anybody would like one. Anybody want one? Okay. Would you hand those out to anybody that wants one? Okay. Here you go. When you study the New Testament, you start reading and you run across things that the first time they're ever mentioned is just there, and it doesn't tell you where it's from, who it is, what it is. Things like the Pharisees and synagogue and all kinds of stuff. And so that's what I'm trying to do, is to show you where all that, the background came from. So when you do study Scripture, it makes a little more sense. One of the important elements that we need to understand about the time of Christ is what had happened to the priesthood. Now, originally, God had established the priesthood from the tribe of Levi. How many tribes of Israel were there? 13. But you never hear about the 13 tribes. It's always the 12 tribes. Why are there not listed 12 tribes? Or why aren't they called 13 tribes?
Levi's dedicated.
Because the Levites were set aside by God to serve His purposes, so He didn't even count them. That's how special the Levite tribe was. And so, God had established that the priest would come out of the tribe of Levi. And they had certain qualifications they had to meet to be priests. And then, of course, to be high priest, you had to be a direct descendant of Aaron, Moses' brother. Aaron was the first high priest of Israel. And then God had to pick you hand-picked. Men didn't pick you. God picked you. So the high priest was a very important job. Why?
You're helping to atone the sins of Israel.
Yeah. He was also the only one in the entire nation that could go into the most holy place and, like you said, offer blood to God to atone for the sins of the nation. So his job was vital. And God had a lot of requirements for the high priest. He could only marry certain people. He had to have certain qualifications and so forth. And that lasted up until 300 or 400 years before Christ came along, and then everything changed. By the time of Christ, the office of the high priesthood was no longer what it had been under the Old Covenant. By the time of Christ, the high priest was no longer qualified. And that had happened earlier, back when the kingdom was split in 930 BC. Jeroboam, who took off 10 of the tribes, he carried them off, or he didn't carry them off, but he seduced them to follow him. He became the king of the 10 tribes. And then Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, the rightful king, was left with 2 of the tribes. Jeroboam was afraid to allow his people to go back to Jerusalem to worship. because he was afraid they might want to reunite with the south, and he didn't want any threat to his kingdom. So he built 2 places of worship in the north. What's the problem with that? They were not authorized by God. He also appointed men to be priests who were not qualified at all. Some of them weren't even from the tribe of Levi. And so over the centuries, that had carried down. And by the time of Christ, there were a lot of good priests. Many of the priests were qualified, but the high priesthood had fallen completely away. By the time of Christ, the high priest was not qualified at all to be priest. Now here's his outfit. I think I need to get something like that to preach in. I mean, that is so cool. I look good in the dress, wouldn't I? Yeah. But by the time of Christ, the high priesthood was no longer qualified to be priest under God's rules. Now, some of the other priests were, but the high priest was not qualified to be high priest. His office had become a political office. He became the ruler of the nation. He was a member of the Sadducees. We talked last week about what a Sadducee is. The Sadducees were the elites. They were the wealthy. They were the powerful of the nation. And the high priesthood had become a political office. And they dealt with foreign powers. When the Romans came in, the high priesthood dealt with the Romans, and he was on their side because the high priest had figured out how they could make money. It seems like that corrupts a lot of people. Money is a bad thing sometimes. And so the high priest figured out that since all the sacrifices had to be done at the temple, and all the sacrifices had to be okayed by the priests. Now, when you brought your cow or your goat or your bird or whatever to offer it as a sacrifice, under the law of Moses, it had to be inspected by the priests. And what did it have to qualify? Had to be without blemish. You couldn't be crippled, it couldn't be blind, it couldn't have weird spots on it. In other words, you're offering it to God, so it's supposed to be your best. So you don't offer crippled and blind animals, sick animals to God. Now, if you were going to offer an animal and you weren't really too careful, which animal are you going to offer? If you don't really care about God, you got to offer a sacrifice. You offer one that's not too great. Well, God said, I don't want that. So they inspected the animals before they would sacrifice them. Now, the high priest and his crowd had figured out, if we don't accept people's offerings, but we will sell them one of ours. And the high priest and his crowd had vast herds and flocks around Jerusalem of animals. And they kept them in the temple courts, the outer courtyard. Can you imagine going to the temple and there'd be thousands of sheep and goats in the courtyards? So what they would do is they would turn your animal down, say it's not qualified, but we'll sell you one. But they would sell it to you for 3 times what it was worth in the market. They were making a huge profit on every single animal. How many sacrifices were there at the temple every year? Millions. What kind of money were they making? They were making millions upon millions upon millions of dollars back when $1 million was a lot of money. And so the high priest had become thoroughly corrupt. They didn't care about God. The Sadducees didn't believe in life after death. They didn't believe in angels. To them it was a political deal, and they were getting rich off of it. So this is what happened by the time Christ came along. The high priesthood was thoroughly corrupted. Now, there were 24,000 priests in Israel at the time of Christ. They were divided into 24 different groups of 1,000 each. And the priests not only would work at the temple, but they also worked it throughout the village. Every village had its own priest. What were some things priests did?
Oh, they inspected people if they have diseases or something like that.
Yeah, if you got sick, you went to the priest. You didn't go to the doctor, you went to the priest. And if he thought you had a contagious disease, he would order you into isolation for a week or two. And he wouldn't let you out in the public until you got well. And that was one reason Israel had fewer contagious plagues than any other nation in history. And the priests did all kinds of things. They were important people. But they took turns at the temple. And there were 24 divisions of priests. Like I said, there were 24,000 priests. They would take turns serving at the temple. Now, in the text, you'll read about the chief priests. These are who they are. Now, the high priest is one group, and then the chief priest, each of those 24,000, each of the 1,000 group of the 24, there were 24 groups, would have a priest over them, and he was called the chief priest. So New Testament mentions them often, the chief priest. We read that and we say, well, who is the chief priest? Well, that's who they were. They were the heads of the divisions of priests. And so many of them were in the Sanhedrin. They were important people in the nation. And so you got the high priest and his crowd, Annas and Caiaphas. Now, they made it a family affair. They kept swapping it back and forth. And they were making they were making millions off the deal. I mean, they were getting filthy rich. Not only did they control the sacrificial system, but they had a rule that whenever you visited Jerusalem from another country, and thousands of Jews every year came to Jerusalem to worship at the temple, they had to pay the temple tax. Every Jew paid the temple tax. Now, running a temple was an expensive proposition. They had to have all this wood. They had to have all this incense. They had to, do lots of things. And it took money. So people paid the temple tax. Every Jew had to pay the temple tax once a year. Well, the Jews had a rule that money could not have an image on it. Why? Because it's idol worship. Yeah. And the Jews would not accept a coin that had a picture on it. Well, most countries, what picture did you have on the coin? The king. Yeah. If you came from Rome, a Roman coin would have a picture of the emperor on it. Well, what the high priest and his crowd said, they put up money changing tables. And if you brought your money to them, they wouldn't accept it as a temple tax, but they would exchange your money for their money. But guess what you do? You charge them a penalty. You charge them a fee for changing their money. So not only was the high priest making big bucks off of every single sacrifice, but he was making big bucks off of the exchange of money. So again, it was a money-making scheme. So why did Jesus get so mad and clear the temple? He says, you guys have turned the worship of God into a den of thieves. Now, the old law permitted you to charge interest, but nothing like what they were charging. It's called usury. And so the priesthood, by the time of Christ, the high priest had nothing to do with religion. They were operating a business, and they were the political power in the nation. That's why Jesus ran afoul of them often. So when Jesus comes along and he starts telling people, I'm the Messiah, why did the high priest hate him so much?
They'd be the first ones doing
Yeah, because they were scared to death that Jesus was going to stand up on the Temple Mount and declare himself to be the Messiah and lead the children of Israel in a war against the Romans. And what would the Romans do? Which they had done before.
Take out the leadership.
They'll take out the lead. They'll send the army in. Now, the Romans didn't keep an army in Jerusalem. They kept a small garrison. But they had a major army stationed at Caesarea, not far away. And they would march in whenever there's several rebellions. The Jews were kind of rebellious. And whenever the Jews rebelled, the Romans would send in the army and they would wipe them out. I mean, the Romans did not put up... There were two things you did if you were under Roman domination. What's that?
Pay taxes.
Pay your taxes, keep the peace. And that's about all the Romans demanded. If you pay your taxes and keep the peace, they pretty much leave you alone. But any rebellion, they would stomp on it in a hurry. And the high priest thought, if this Jesus fellow starts a riot, the Romans will come marching in and we'll be the first ones they execute. So they wanted Jesus dead in a hurry. The Pharisees hated Jesus because they thought of him as a heretic. He was teaching stuff that went against their rules. You remember, they had come up with all these thousands of rules to add to God's rules. And Jesus kept telling them, those aren't God's rules, those are your rules. And what was their attitude?
How dare you?
How dare you? We represent God. Our rules are just there to help God's rules. And Jesus kept saying, God's rules don't need any help. Just do what they say. So this is the political situation in Israel during the time of Christ. All right. Last week we talked about the Greek period. Now the Greeks came in the 330s BC. And we talked about how the Greeks had tried to force Hellenism down the throats of the Jews. The Jews rebelled. It had been a big mess. Eventually, the Romans came along, and they kicked the Greeks out, and they took over Israel. In 63 BC, the Roman general marched into Jerusalem. He conquered the city. He did not destroy it. He just conquered the whole region and put everything under Roman rule. And so this is the period of history that Jesus was born into. The Romans ruled the world. Herod the Great. Herod the Great was not a Roman. He was an Idumean. Where's Idumea? Anybody know? I'd be surprised if you did. Idumea is south of Israel. And Herod the Great was an Idumean. Herod the Great and his father were very politically astute. The Romans had a civil war. And if you're a wise politician, what do?
On the winning side.
You get on the winning side. They backed one of the generals in the fight. Two of the Roman generals were fighting each other to be emperor. They got on the wrong side. But when they realized it, what did they do? Switch sides, yeah. As any good politician would do. And so when the war was over, then they convinced the survivor, we were on your side all the time.
See that today.
Well, yeah, it's very common. So Herod the Great was not a Roman, he was not a Jew, and that was going to cause a problem. So Herod the Great, in 37 BC, again this is 37 years before Christ comes to town, Herod the Great got the Romans to appoint him to be king over Israel and Syria. And so he reigned from 37 BC up to 4 BC. Herod had 3 sons. And when Herod died, we'll talk more about the other events in that. When Herod died, his 3 sons divided his empire amongst themselves. One of them was so crazy, the Romans couldn't even put up with him, and so they replaced him. He was Herod Archelaus. He was nuts. And so the Romans said, we're not putting up with you, so they kicked him out, and they brought a Roman governor in. And that's why there was a Roman governor over Jerusalem. But the Herod still ruled in Galilee and elsewhere in the empire. So when Jesus comes in, there's a Roman governor over Jerusalem, but not over Galilee. And that's because one of Herod's sons had to be replaced. And that's where the Roman governor comes from. That's why Jesus had to stand trial before Pilate. One of the important events of this period of history, now remember, this is all part of God's master plan. This, to me, is so amazing. How God worked thousands of people, hundreds of years, empires. It's amazing God put all this together to produce one effect. Does anybody know what the Pax Romana is?
Time of peace, right?
The time of peace. It's the longest period in recorded history when there were no major wars. And when the Romans took over the world, from 27 BC down to 180 AD, there were no major wars. Now, why was this so important to the New Testament story?
It's easy to spread the gospel if there's no war going on.
Well, yeah. How can you spread the gospel if there's a war going on? If there's a war, what happens?
You have instability, you have borders.
Instabilities, borders, it's hard to travel. And so for this period of time, which you'll notice covers the time when the church began to spread throughout the Roman Empire, there were no major conflicts. And the Romans had armies stationed all over the world. And they guarded the roads, they kept the roads repaired, they kept everything moving, and it made it a lot easier to spread the gospel. Again, it's amazing how you see God's hand in everything. Like I said, the roads were an important part. How would that help the gospel? Travel. Yeah, I mean, in the world, you travel on roads. Particularly in that part of the world, the terrain is rough. It's hard to travel. But the Romans built the most extensive system of roads in the world up until President Eisenhower authorized the U.S. interstate system. Matter of fact, the roads the Romans built are so good, many of them are still used today. And they built these roads throughout the Roman Empire. Like I said, this is one still around today. It's just amazing.
Even without toll roads, too.
And not even without toll. Yeah, they don't even pay tolls. But the road system was astonishing. And like I said, many of them are still going today. And so it made the spread of the gospel much easier because they had roads to travel. And it gave the Romans something to guard. And so they could keep the thieves. And, in those days, thieves were a big problem. Robbers, well, if you had ample roads, the Romans could guard the road system. So God used the Romans for his own purposes, even though they were complete pagans. All right, there's some additional factors we need to know who they are because you're going to run across them in Scripture, and it does not tell you who they are. First of all, there were the zealots. Who's the most famous zealot? Yeah, one of the apostles was a zealot. What's a zealot? Well, when the Greeks and the Romans moved in and took over, some of the Jews didn't like it. And they were a paramilitary group. And at first, they opposed the Romans, but as time went on, they became an opposition group militarily. They began to attack Romans, and they would, steal from them and kill them. And unfortunately, over decades of this kind of behavior, what tends to happen?
More extreme.
They become more extreme. They became more criminal. And so when Jesus went to the cross, the two guys that were nailed next to him on the crosses were from this group. Now, the scriptural word is telestai. That means they came from this group. They weren't just thieves. They're also called murderers. They were terrorists, basically. They hated Romans. They hated anybody. And basically, by that time, they were kind of a criminal organization. So they were horrible people. So when Jesus picked one as an apostle, what did that say? And who else was on his apostles?
Tax collector.
A tax collector. And tax collectors and zealots, man, they hated each other. Zealots killed tax collectors. Why?
They were for Rome.
Tax collectors worked for the Romans. And so to have a zealot and a tax collector on Jesus' apostles group was amazing. The Essenes. There was a sect. These are all sects and divisions of the Jews. The Zealots were a sect. The Essenes were a sect. There was an Essene quarter in Jerusalem. And you'll read about them in Scripture. It talks about the Essenes. The Essenes were Jews who believed in keeping the law, all of it, but they wanted to keep away from the rest of the world. So they lived in their own little enclaves. We have people like that today. Who are they? Monks. Amish, people like that. Why do the Amish live together in isolated groups?
But these people that had the Red Sea Scrolls, is that
Yes.
tendency?
Yes. Why do the Amish live away from everybody else?
They want to separate themselves from the world.
Yeah, they want to separate themselves from our bad influence. And they don't use modern equipment and stuff. It's funny, the Amish will drive tractors, but they don't put rubber tires on them. They put metal tires. I don't know why it's all right to have a metal tire but not a rubber tire. At any rate, the Essenes were a group of Jews who believed that religion meant you stay away from bad people, stay away from the world. So they would have their own little villages, their own little parts of town. Like I said, some of them lived in Jerusalem, but they had their own little section, the Essene section. And the Essenes were also the ones that, and God used them to maintain the scriptures. Qumran, where the little village, it was an Essene village, and they were the ones who copied the scriptures over and over and over and kept the scriptures pure. They were very religious about keeping the scriptures pure. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they were found, proved conclusively, and up until then, the Bible critics had a field day. They said, the Bible, you can't trust it. It's been rewritten and recopied, and it's completely out of date, and blah, 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 blah. Well, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, they proved conclusively that the Bible Jesus used is the same Bible that we use. I mean, there's no question about it. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove that the Old Testament we have is exactly the same that was extant when Jesus was there, and it has not changed. So that just destroyed a lot of the attacks on the Bible. Because the oldest scriptures we had before that were 1,000 years in the future. I mean, they were 1,000 years ahead. And naturally, the Bible critic says, well, in 1,000 years, the validity of the scriptures was completely lost. But the Dead Sea Scrolls proved beyond a shadow of doubt, no, they weren't. The scriptures we have are accurate. The Bible talks about the lawyers and the scribes. Now, the lawyers are not lawyers like they are today. The lawyers in the days of Christ, and when you read the New Testament, several times you'll read across the lawyers. The lawyers and the scribes, now they did some legal work, they did some copy work, but their main job was to be experts in the law of Moses. A scribe or a lawyer could be either a Pharisee or a Sadducee. But if you had a question on Scripture, you went to a doctor, you went to a lawyer or a scribe, and they would explain. They were scholars. They studied the Bible all the time. They memorized vast quantities of it. And so they were considered experts. There weren't a lot of them, but they were considered scholars. It'd be like if you said, well, who are the greatest Bible scholars in the world today? You might say, well, let's go to Harvard or, and that's who these guys were. They were the experts in the law.
I wouldn't go to Harvard today.
I wouldn't go to Harvard today, no. Now, the New Testament talks about the Herodians. The Herodians were the Jews who supported the Herods. Most Jews did not support the Herods. Why?
Wasn't he the one that was cheating, Herod, that had John's, the Baptist? Yes. But the Herodians as a group were the political supporters. They were Jews who supported the Herods. Most Jews did not. So they were a political party who supported the Herods. Most Jews hated the Herods because they were not Jews. They were Idumeans and they represented Rome. So you'll read about the Herodians in Scripture. There's not much said about them, but when you run across them, that's who they are.
And then the tax collectors. The Romans had an interesting way of collecting taxes. The Romans would, once they conquered Palestine, they divided all of Israel into taxable sections. The cities were their own tax base. The suburbs were tax base. The ports were tax base. The roads were tax base. And you would say, okay, for Jerusalem next year, we believe that there should be 100,000 gold pieces collected in taxes. And then they would open the bidding. And some enterprising Jew would say, okay, I'll collect 1,000 gold pieces from Jerusalem. And they would say, you got the job. And brother, you better come up with it. They were not understanding. He says, well, we came up a little short. No. And then the tax collector, he would buy Jerusalem as his tax area. And by the end of the year, he had to have 100,000 gold pieces to send to Rome. As long as he did that, the Romans didn't care. So the tax collector over Jerusalem would then subdivide the city into, say, 10 different sections. And he would tell each, he would hire guys to collect taxes on their section. He might say, okay, you have the northeast corner of the city, and you have to collect 25,000 gold pieces. And the guy would say, okay, I'll take care of it. Now, what's the problem with this kind of system of tax collection?
Use it.
How did you make your money as a tax collector? They didn't pay you.
You got 26,000.
You got 26,000. Yeah. You would collect more taxes than you had to turn over to Rome. And whatever you collected beyond the required amount would be yours. Like the tax collector who had all of Jerusalem. If he had to collect 100,000 gold coins, if he collected 200,000, he got to keep everything over 100,000. The Romans just said, you have to pay us 100,000. So naturally, what did the tax collectors tend to do? They overcharged everybody. That's one reason they were so loved. Yes, ma'am.
But didn't the people know that they were being overcharged?
Well, sure. What are you going to do about it? They've got the Roman government behind them. If they come into your house and say, you owe me 75 gold pieces, you're going to say, well, I'm not paying it. That's not fair. They say, okay. They go down the road and get a squad of Roman soldiers and come in and hold you sword to your throat and say, don't you want to pay it? Yeah, now that you mention it, I think I'll pay it. They didn't put up with not paying your taxes. Now, obviously, if you got too ridiculous about it, then the Romans would step in and do something. Or your boss would, the guy who you have to collect. But basically, the system was ripe for corruption. I mean, if you give a tax collector unlimited power, and he makes a profit off of every tax collection, he's going to make sure he gets his and then some. You remember when Jesus went to Jericho, he ran into Zacchaeus. And Zacchaeus said, well, if I've overcharged anybody, I'll pay back 4 times what I have charged, because he had been abusing the system. And yes.
So they had the backing of the Roman army.
They had the backing of the Roman army, yeah. If you refused to pay your taxes, there was a Roman army sitting over at Caesarea, and they'd be happy to send some troops over to help you collect the taxes. So you just didn't refuse to pay your tax. As long as you paid your taxes and kept the peace, Rome wouldn't bother you. But brother, if you didn't pay your taxes, they'd come to town. And they made it obvious you really do want to pay your taxes. Not only were most tax collectors corrupt, why would the Jews also hate tax collectors?
They consider them traitors.
They were traitors. They worked for the Romans. They didn't work for Jews. They worked for Romans. And so the average Jew despised tax collectors. They thought they were traitors. They were corrupt. They were thieves. They were dishonest. Nobody liked tax collectors. That's why the Bible talks so often about tax collectors and Jesus eating with the tax collectors.
They're helping the enemy.
They were the enemy.
It'd be like if Russia took over the United States and then somebody started working for Russia.
Yes, yes. It's just like in World War II, you had several traitors. You've heard of Quisling. He worked with the Germans, and there were several traders in World War II who worked with the Germans. And after the war, many of them got strung up. But the Jews hated tax collectors. And Matthew was a tax collector. He worked for the Roman government. And so Jesus had a tax collector and a zealot working for him. I got a feeling there was a lot of venomous looks between the two of them at first. Now let's talk about the wise men. When you see postcards and Christmas movies, what do you always see?
3 guys on camels.
You see 3 guys riding camels. And what does the song teach us?
Three gifts.
We three men of Orient are, and they were considered to be kings. You always see them with crowns and so forth. None of that's true. That's all Hollywood, okay? The wise men, the Magi, were actually from Persia. There was a tribe of Persians called Magi. They were scholars. They studied the stars. They studied mathematics. They studied science. They studied government. They were considered the wisest men on earth, the greatest scholars on the planet. So it became very fashionable for every king to have wise men on his staff. Why? Yes.
They weren't only just scholars. I think they were like SEAL Team 6.
Well, they carried with them some SEAL teams, yeah. But the wise men were known as good for helping kings. If you had some wise men on your staff, if you were the king, you hired wise men to come to your throne, and they would advise you. And you kept several on staff, and you paid them good money. They were considered to be brilliant men. And if you had wise men on your staff, the rest of the kings in the world would respect you. They also trained the next generation of kings. If you were a king, you hired wise men to train your son to be the next king. They were king trainers. And then when it came time for the son to take over the job, the wise men were there to help promote him as the new king. They were king makers and king trainers.
So anytime you have like a young person that becomes king, like we see like with the Geisa, it's like that.
Yeah.
You had those people.
Yes, they would train the new king, they would prepare him, and then they would do the actual promotion of him to the kingship. And if you were promoted by the wise men, you were more respected as a king in the world. So they were very important people. But they were not kings. They were scholars, okay? Now the wise men had been told by a prophecy hundreds of years earlier that there was someone coming very special. They were told by God that there is a Messiah coming. Now, I don't know if he told them that word, but he told them there's someone coming. It had been a tradition among the wise men for centuries that they knew someone special was coming. One day God appears to them. He says, "There's someone special I was telling you about is going to be born in Palestine. Follow the star." So they had been taught that. So a bunch of them take off. They didn't travel in threes. They traveled in large caravans. These were Persians. They didn't ride camels. What do Persians ride? Horses. So this picture is completely not right. This is what you see in Hollywood or on postcards. This is not what really wise men were. There was a large group of them. They normally traveled in large groups. Like an army, a small army. And they always traveled with Persian cavalry. Now, Persian cavalry were the most feared warriors in the world at that time. Who were the only people the Romans had not been able to conquer? The Persians. Persian cavalry was considered the most dangerous cavalry ever. And Romans didn't like to tangle with them. The Persian cavalry could ride circles around the Roman legions. The Romans were primarily foot soldiers.
Shoot them if they did.
And the Persian cavalry was well trained with using a recurved bow, and they would shoot arrows at you. That's not fair. When you've got a sword and this guy's shooting at you. This is a Persian cavalry man. Now, a large troop of Persian cavalry would travel with the wise men. So when the wise men showed up in Jerusalem one day, now get the picture. Herod was the most paranoid guy who ever lived. Herod had a reputation throughout the world as being paranoid. What's paranoid?
Always somebody's always out to get you.
Yeah, somebody's out to get you. Well, it's not paranoid if it's true. But Herod believed that everybody's wanting his job.
He even killed some of his own family.
He murdered 2 of his own sons because he thought they might want his job. There was no evidence that either one of them ever did, but he killed them. He had his father-in-law drowned. He murdered one of his wives because he thought she might be after his job. I mean, all he had to do was think you might be after his job, and he eliminated you. He wasn't about to have any challenges to his kingship. Now, get the picture. He's sitting in Jerusalem. Everything's cool. And suddenly, at his city gates, shows up this large group of wise men. And what's their job?
Train kings.
King makers, king trainers. And what is their message?
He's a king.
Somebody special here.
So there's a new king in town. There's a new king that's been born. We're here to see him. So what did Herod do?
Tried to kill him.
He went berserk. He said, what are you talking about, a new king? Now, these guys had a lot of credibility. And if they said, our prophecies have told us, our holy men have told us that there's a king coming and he's here, we've been following this star, and he has been born, and we've come to worship him. Herod went berserk. The text, if you read the text there, it says Herod was disturbed. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, our time is up. You're going to have to wait till next week to find out how this story ends.